Join me, Phil Stephanie, and Russell Gerber on an interactive show designed to give you more insight and context to all things African.
And on today's show, we'll be chatting about the wonderful and wild dogs. My name is Russell Gerber, folks, and of course, with you for the next half an hour, where we'll be discussing these wonderful creatures. If you have any questions, please do send them through. Of course, you have to register on the site to do so, and just pop those questions through, and I'll do my best to get to them. But without further ado, this lovely shot of one of my favorite animals in Africa. This is, of course, the beautiful wild dog, and we're going to chat a little bit about the various identifying features. We'll go through various behavior, hunting, and also all sorts to cover an in-depth look at this particular species. So wild dogs weigh in at around 19 to 30 kgs or so, around about 60 to 75 centimeters at the shoulder, so pretty much the same size as your average German Shepherd. The scientific name is actually Lycaon pictus, which, if you actually translate the words themselves, Lycaon meaning wolf and pictus, which means painted. So you would have heard many people in the past call them painted wolves or painted dogs. But they go from a number of different names: wild dogs, Cape hunting dog, all sorts of different names that we refer to them. But we'll be using that term wild dogs for today. In this little diagram, you can actually see the current distribution of the species. And wild dogs actually occurred through much of sub-Saharan Africa, besides the equatorial forests in the center of this picture. Today, unfortunately, they are confined to the protected areas around the continent. And we'll get into a little later why that has occurred. But essentially, their populations have been broken up into much smaller groups. And with that, the numbers have reduced significantly over the last 50 years or so to around about 5,000 to 6,000 individuals. But as you can see, they are certainly one of the most beautiful species that we have here in Africa, and one of our most iconic predators. They are a cooperative, social species. They spend their time together in packs, and the pack will work together in hunting, in protecting their areas or home ranges, and of course protecting from other potential predators that might attempt to scavenge from them, or of course injure or kill their cubs or pups. These, of course, are a couple of videos taken from some of our locations around Africa, South Africa, and we'll go through each one as they come up. But generally, your viewing of wild dogs tends to be short and sweet. They're often on the move and can move long distances really quickly. To put that in perspective for you, we have around about, or home ranges of around about 250 kilometers, up to 2,000 square kilometers in dry areas. And as you saw in the map earlier, we've got them occurring in pretty much East Africa, Central Africa, but the majority of them occurring in Southern Africa, mostly centralized to the Kruger National Park and parts of northern Botswana. And we'll go through the reasons why that has occurred, and also the conservation programs we have in place. In terms of the dogs themselves, you can see in this clip, hunting is a huge part of their daily activities. Your packs are normally around 10 to 15 individuals. They will normally hunt during the day or in the early mornings or early evenings, which of course is known as a crepuscular animal. They hunt together, generally on a slow approach. So they'll move together, as you see here in this video. They will move to approach the potential prey species, all of them looking out for any potential opportunity that may come along. And when they do see something they're interested in, they will generally spread out, sneak up fairly slowly, but then actually, without worrying too much about being seen, they will charge ahead and chase down the prey species using their incredible endurance and speeds of up to around 50 kilometers an hour to eventually chase down that species, tire it out, and subdue it, where they will then very quickly eat that species. This picture was taken in the Okavango Delta, and this particular group, shortly after this photograph, actually took down an impala. It was a pack of around 12 individuals, actually annihilated that impala and ate it from living, caught, full grown male impala to absolutely nothing left but the bones within around 5 minutes. I kid you not. And that is how ferocious feeders they are and how dependent they are on protein intake they are on a daily basis, just about. Depending on the size of the pack, they often will hunt at least once a day, sometimes twice a day, just to sustain them, particularly a group of this size, which was around 12 individuals. This, of course, is an amazing clip that we caught on camera from Tau. And for those of you who are a little sensitive, it's not always easy to watch these sorts of things. As you can see here, this is a wild dog that had actually chased an impala into the waterhole at Tau. If you look carefully on the right-hand side, you'll see another major predator sneaking in on the situation. Look at that wild dog hightails it out of there after that crocodile enters the fray. And you'll see in a moment the crocodile then basically absconds that prey from the wild dogs that you can now see hanging out next to the edge of the waterhole and looking really disappointed in the fact they've now lost their meal to, again, another one of Africa's top predators. And this is not an unusual behavior that you see wild dogs do, where they'll actually chase animals towards water holes, and potential prey species will use water as a potential to escape. But as you saw in the beginning of this video, wild dogs will happily go into water. But the risk is, of course, another big predator like this crocodile. You can see here it's now grabbed onto this impala. And though it's not easy to watch, I can tell you, we will be going through this video and watching it together. The dogs don't give up. They keep watching in the hope that they actually get their meal back, but it doesn't look very likely at this point. But I'll give you a spoiler, because some I know find it hard to watch. This impala actually managed to escape from this interaction. Both the crocodile and the wild dogs missed out on this meal, so easily one of the luckiest impala to ever grace the planet. But what will happen in a hunt like this when it is actually successful is, as I mentioned, the dogs themselves will actually gorge themselves on the prey they've taken down, and will then make their way back to the den if they are denning at the time. They will actually then regurgitate partially digested meat for the youngsters and even for other members of the pack who are injured or were staying behind to babysit the pups. Bearing in mind, this is one of Africa's most successful hunters, taking down around 60% of the prey that they chase down. So even though they have to work hard to get enough meat for the group, they are more often than not successful at getting what they chase. But they do have to worry about other predators out there. Things like hyena, particularly lions, will readily kill wild dogs if they come across them and the dogs are not aware of their presence. Very often you will find hyena following wild dogs closely, knowing that their success is high in catching predator or catching prey. And often, if there's not a lot of dogs around, that a single hyena will be able to hijack that kill or scavenge that kill from the dogs themselves. So very often you'll see hyenas not too far behind a pack of dogs like this. As you can see, these two not too sure what to do in this particular instance. They were pretty certain they had a meal in the bag. But unfortunately for them, they missed out on this particular instance. Now, the pack will generally go out to hunt together. These two individuals will be part of the same pack, and packs are made up of unrelated males and females, and generally in a system of a dominant alpha male and an alpha female, and they will normally be the only two to actually breed, potentially a beta male and female who will sometimes breed as well. The entire pack will work towards looking after those pups and making sure that they make it through to adulthood. And normally, you'll have one female pregnant at a time, or in estrus at a time, and falling pregnant. And after around about 70 days or so, we'll often get around between 2 to 10 pups in one litter. Which is obviously a lot of mouths to feed. In around about 8 weeks, they will actually be weaned, which means after that, they have to get pretty much full meat diet every single day, which again increases the amount of time the pack needs to spend hunting for food. And those pups will hang around the den for about 3 months. So a lot of hard work before the pups will actually eventually join the pack themselves out on hunts. So very intricate social system and social structure. It's an interesting one, quite different from many of the other species we see. Their way of dispersal for the genes, you must be wondering, is, of course, within the pack, often a group of females or a group of males will break away and meet up with other individual males or females from different packs who have left their pack. They will then bond together and form their own pack with a new alpha male and female. And that tends to be how you get genetic diversity within the group. This was a photo taken in the Kruger National Park and of a group of young pups. It was a group of around 8 pups in this particular instance. And of course, always fun to watch such a beautiful animal. And they behave very much like your puppies that you've had at home. Very similar behaviors, a very vocal species as well, with all sorts of squeals and yelps that they will make for different signs and different information that they'll share within the group. But as I mentioned earlier, a very social group of animals, and there'll be a lot of this touching, being very close together to reinforce those bonds within the pack. One of the interesting things that we've actually noted in wild dog behavior is they've noted in Botswana that it's possible that sneezing often suggests a time to start hunting. So if you've ever seen that with dogs in the wild, it's quite an interesting thing to watch. As I mentioned, after around about 3 months or so, the pups will actually leave the den and join the pack, join them on hunts. They'll often lag behind the older ones until they're old enough to actually take animals down with the adults themselves. this is an endangered species, as I mentioned. Around about 5 or 6,000 individuals left, and this is the focus of populations within South Africa. As you can see, broken up into certain protected areas within the country, and of course, areas where we have cameras out in the bush. The big red areas, of course, Kruger National Park, and the blue spots, these meta-population reserves, which we're going to chat about in a minute. So to explain to you what's going on here, around 20 years ago, it was noted that the population of dogs in the Kruger Park was dropping significantly. And through a lot of research, it was decided that in order for the genetic diversity to be viable in one area, you need around 9 individual packs of dogs, consisting of around 5 adults per pack. So within those 9 packs, it would make that population viable. Now, with this shrinking of numbers, it was a concern that that genetic diversity was going to start breaking down. So the solution was to move certain individuals to different parts of the country where we would have 1 or 2 packs in 9 different areas, as opposed to the 9 packs in one area. Now, that was to do with the large home ranges that we touched on before, and just made it easier to break up the pressure of protecting those species only in one location. So how then do we get genetic diversity in that way? Well, of course, the only way to do it from there would be to actually manually take subadult males or females, bring them into a new reserve and one of these meta-population reserves. And what we would then do is actually put them into a boma together, the unrelated males and unrelated females. They then bond as a pack within the boma, and then they're released into the reserve. And what you can see in this map here, this was a focused map of the KwaZulu-Natal region. And if you look at the top of this slide in yellow, you'll see Tembe Elephant Park as one of these wild dog meta populations. In the previous slide, you saw also Madikwe and, of course, the area of Kruger, which is still a free-ranging population, all of which now are doing really well because of these conservation programs. Considering this is a species with significantly dropping numbers across the rest of the continent, this program in South Africa and Southern Africa, including Botswana and Zimbabwe, has made this a much more viable species in many of these locations, but it is quite intensive in terms of its conservation. We have to, of course, have individuals on the ground consistently following individuals, and you'll find that many times when you do see dogs out in the wild, that at least one of the alpha male or female will actually have a radio telemetry collar on them. And the reason for that, of course, is to keep track of them as best as possible. A species that is so threatened at the moment or endangered across the world, it is something that we are working very hard to protect, to, of course, keep viewing of them for our next generations going forward in the future. In this little clip, you might have just seen a flash of dogs through the screen itself. I actually wanted to put this in just to give you an idea of how quickly the animals move themselves. You know, some of the most exciting game drives I've ever done out in the bush is following wild dogs on a hunt. They move fast, they move long distances, often through extremely rough terrain, and you can see here a game drive vehicle in the background trying to keep up with the dogs. So very often we call it the wild dog madness, because the guards will drive like crazy just to keep up and hopefully catch a sighting of the dogs actually taking something down on a hunt itself. What's interesting about this species as well is that despite all the adaptations for working towards raising the cubs, their very high success rate at hunting, it's quite shocking that the numbers have dropped off so significantly across the continent. And many people wonder why. And it almost always comes down to the competition between, well, the conflict between animals and humans. And wild dog in particular were targeted as a wanton predator of livestock, which is not actually entirely true. They will sometimes take down two or three wild stock if they do actually get out of the reserves. But for the most part, they will only hunt what they need to catch. But they got a bad reputation for many years, and for that reason, when they left reserves, they were often exterminated. However, the biggest impact really on their population is their susceptibility to domestic animals and the diseases that they carry. Things like canine distemper and rabies, uh, kennel cough, other viruses that your domestic dogs at home can get are hugely, hugely threatening to the wild dogs. Due to their denning nature and the nature of the pack, if one of them happens to pick it up, they will bring it back to the pack, and almost certainly within a short period of time, the entire pack will become infected, and that is often the cause for that entire pack being eliminated. So that has been the major cause in the drop of numbers for this particular species. And in many instances, when they do move the animals between reserves in order to improve that genetic diversity and create those meta populations we chatted about, they'll often actually inoculate the individuals that they move for things like rabies and distemper that we spoke about, again, just to give them that little extra bit of help to get that population growing again. And we got a few questions that I wanted to address, and thank you to all of you for sending those through. A quick hello to some of our usuals, to Suki and Philippe, Stephanie, Andre. Thank you so much for joining us, and all the rest of you out there. And Suki asks, hyenas often get friendly with humans and not wild dogs. Is there any reason? It's a good question, Suki. Hyenas and wild dogs are actually quite naturally inquisitive animals. But wild dogs are actually really distrustful of humans themselves and will almost never come too close. I've spent time in the bush in Botswana where I was actually managing a camp. We often had to walk a fairly long distance from the staff quarters to the main area. And on many occasions, we would bump into a resident group of dogs, wild dogs, that we would see on foot within 10 meters of us. And every time they would look at you and happily run away without any reaction whatsoever, simply to move off on their own. So though they are inquisitive and will often approach vehicles and things like that, if you're on foot, it's highly unlikely they will stick around. And they're really not interested in humans in general. Hyenas tend to be a little bit braver in that regard. And with the added bulk and power in their jaws and shoulders, they feel a little bit more safe, whereas dogs tend to be much more fragile and, as I said, generally distrustful of humans. This is a great clip also taken from one of our cameras where the dogs were investigating this little water hole. It's just off picture, but it was actually a crocodile in the water there as well, and they're just not sure what's going on. But a great clip to show you the size that you sometimes can get of packs of wild dogs. And of course, a group like this of roughly around 20 individuals. It takes a lot to keep them all well fed. And almost always you'll see them hunting around about this time. This looks like it was taken in late afternoon. Or, of course, early morning, which tends to be the most common times that you'll see these dogs out on the hunt. Andre also asks, is the social structure of a group of wild dogs similar to that of wolves? And he also says that I answered his question, discussing their social structure. As far as I know, Andre, yes, very similar in terms of their behaviors. They're not from the same group as the wolves. They're actually more closely related to domestic dogs, and many people ask why they haven't been domesticated over the years, and really comes down to that distrust of humans. They often don't do well in captivity as well, even in zoos, and that may come down to the fact that they do need a lot of space to roam, but often can be difficult to tell why animals don't do well if they are provided food and some healthcare, mates, other species or other individuals from their species. But sometimes they just don't do well. And wild dogs, so far, it has been shown that they don't tend to do too well in captivity. And Stephanie asks, is this where domestic dogs came from, or is that totally different? So I think I just covered that for you, Stephanie. They are actually from the same group of dogs that were eventually domesticated. But wild dogs, as far as I know, in any instance, have never been domesticated in Africa. And I'm pretty sure we'll never see that actually occur in our lifetime, certainly. One of the great things about the dogs themselves that I find so interesting is their coloration is unique to every individual, almost as unique as a fingerprint for us. And it's one of the ways that conservationists and researchers use to identify them. You can see this group on the right-hand side, those big puffy tails that get flicked out when they are actually hanging out together and if they are getting excited. They're often quite playful. As I said, those social bonds really, really important for the survival of the pack. And it's also thought that those white tips on the end of the tail are really helpful in aiding in hunting as a pack, being able to see where the other individuals are, particularly when they're chasing something down through thicker woodland areas or in long grass in the savannah, and the other individuals from the pack can see that white tail sticking out through the bush. But a beautiful sighting, this nonetheless, as I said, caught on one of our cameras. And I hope that we get some more of these good dog sightings as we head into the winter. They tend to give birth during the winter as well. So if you do get a den that's nearby one of our water holes, which is often where many of your prey species will be hanging out, it's likely that your sightings of dogs in the area will be pretty spectacular, as the pack will be nearby, and generally, because they're out hunting even once or twice a day, you'll often see them quite frequently. So we can only hope that that does happen this season and we get lucky enough to see these beautiful creatures more frequently throughout the winter season. And I got time for one more question. Suki asks, is the alpha male and female at the front? When they're out hunting, Suki, they do often hang out in the front, but that's not a rule, as you often see with elephants. Um, they will just be amongst the group. If the alpha female is, of course, pregnant, or if she has pups, she will normally be back at the den, and they will come back and feed her. One more question and we'll squeeze in just before we go. Philippe asks, when the puppies are not from the alphas, do the alphas take care of them anyway, or do they leave the job to other members of the pack? The whole pack will help look after the pups, Philippe. But I've actually seen a pack where the betas gave birth to the pups, and the alpha actually had pups at a similar time, which is also unusual. And she took over nursing those pups completely on her own. Um, and they raised all those pups to adulthood. And as they got to adulthood, the packs actually split up into those different groups, like I mentioned. So anything is possible in these different groups, but that is unusual. It tends to be just the alphas that are generally giving birth to pups. Well, folks, that's about it from us today for our On Point show on wild dogs. I hope you enjoyed that little insight. We can talk about these chaps for days. Certainly one of Africa's most interesting animals and our most endangered large carnivore on the continent. Let's hope that these conservation programs continue and we can keep looking after these amazing animals and view them long into the future. But as always, it's been a pleasure hanging out with you for the last half an hour. Thank you for your questions and interaction. And we'll see you all again next week for our next On Point show. Thank you as always. Cheers for now.